Welcome to VIV Today, the daily business podcast from the Business in Vancouver newsroom. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief, and my guest today is the man behind the Winter Olympic Games that came to British Columbia 10 years ago. John Furlong is likely still catching up on his sleep from that period, but I thought he'd be coherent enough now to discuss things. We've got you out of that lapsed state. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Want to focus on a wide range of things, on these memories that are pretty good, and then some of the legacy from it. But even take me preceding the games. What was the biggest obstacle to getting them?
Well, I think to getting the games. The biggest obstacle to getting the games in the very beginning was, I think we had this view at the very beginning that everyone's just going to vote for Vancouver. I mean, look at the city; it's gorgeous, and when you come here, it's just addictive, and trying to get everyone's mind around this is actually a real competition, and it's not just all about facilities and systems and reputation. It's very political, and you really have to really be ready for a grinding. If you ask me today which of these processes was the most personally challenging, the bid was just so much more, internal, difficult, painful than delivering the games. And the games were tough. But the thing is, when you have the games, you have the games. When you're bidding, you don't know till 1 second is left in the process that you're actually alive and you're getting the games. So it was pretty getting that, and then realizing we have to play flat out. We can take nothing for granted, and
who were the competitors again?
So it started out with 8 countries. So there was China, Spain, Yugoslavia, France, Switzerland, and so on, and Austria, and Korea, and us, and someone else.
Good that you still remember that. That's like,
it's
like 17
I remember
years,
meeting those
17 years ago.
I remember meeting those guys. I remember meeting the delegation from China that came. They bid against us, and it was just like when they came to hear the first presentation of how you do this, like it looked to me like they had just walked inside Disneyland and they saw this absolutely stunning thing that they had not kind of got their mind around. I mean, I think there is a bit of an attitude when you go into it at the beginning of it. Well, how hard can it be? And it's brutally hard. But getting to understand it and understanding how people vote and understanding the members and the big goal for us was to try to get to a place where we had enough members who were willing to vote for us. But we were also trying to create an environment inside the IOC that there wasn't a campaign against us. In other words, a members campaign against us. So to be a likable bid, to be respected, recognizing that a lot of people wouldn't vote for us because they'll vote on regional lines, cultural lines, and so on. So that was a goal and a strategy. And we also realized that for us to win, we had to beat everyone in Europe or we were going to lose.
Right.
That was not well known to the media because, in the early days that, how this would break down. And so it wasn't appropriate to say it either because it's kind of arrogant to kind of say, well, if we beat Europe, we're going to win.
Well, your bid was almost a metaphor for the country, right? I mean, we're somewhat apologetic for our place in the world.
Right,
so you weren't really going to get your elbows up with the competitors in a true sense and characterize them or vilify them.
Yeah.
You had to.
Well, and you've touched on something that I think that was quite magical about Vancouver. It was the difference maker for us in the bid phase, where we actually took the position of saying to the IOC, we believe that the Olympic Games can be a game changer for Canada. Not just the city, not just the region, that this can be nation building for us. And we think that the Olympic Games will give us an opportunity to, have a conversation with the rest of the world on our own terms, for people to get to know what it is to be Canadian, the difference between a Canadian and an American and so on. And it allowed us to tell a different story than everyone else was telling, because everyone was focused on venues, transportation, so on. We were talking about big picture vision. I don't think anybody doubted we could do it. But it's what will we have at the end if they do it? And
do you remember? Do you remember your first meeting? Do you remember your first? The first time they come to you and said, "John, there's a job."
The meeting with who?
I don't know who you met with. I mean,
I do remember the first meeting, and it was not about the Winter Games. I was the chairman of Sport BC at the time, and the meeting was to discuss whether we would bid for the Summer Games. And there had been a few meetings about this, and some people had been pulled together, and it became really clear really quickly that this was nonsense. We could never pull that off, and we could never rally the
they're
kind
about
of
6 times
resources.
larger, 8 times
multiple
larger?
times larger.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and so the trip to do that would have been much tougher, and it was also very clear that if you take the sports side of that, and even if you could dream your brains out and see the summer games here, for the business community and tourism, it was a bit of a non-starter. It would get right in the way of our traditional, and tourism and business generally saw, well, if the Olympics come in the quiet time, it'll be a huge boost for the city then. So all of those stars were lining up, and we quickly slipped from summer to winter. Which goes to tell you that the people thinking about this at the beginning were more thinking about what the games could do for the country and the city, as opposed to, wouldn't it be great, and thinking about the logistics and the venues and the sports side of it. They were thinking more about the higher power of this. So summer, winter, whatever, it didn't matter. They just wanted to do a good thing. And those early meetings were interesting. And I have one recollection that really sticks out in my mind, and it was the one around everyone will vote for Vancouver. And I was listening to this, and I was, as I said, I would say I was not a tier 1 volunteer at the time. I was probably more like tier 2. I was helping out. I felt I had an obligation to help out. But this conversation started, and I was listening to it, and I went, I think this is nonsense. And so I said, I don't know where we get this idea that people are just going to push the Vancouver button here. I grew up in another city. And I have to tell you that everyone that lives there think they live in the best city in the world.
Yeah.
So this is what you're up against. And they're all going to come with big stories and great visions and fight like a dog to win this. So we need to recognize it's all in front of us. We're getting nothing for free here.
Yeah.
And that to me was kind of the first step of getting past that and realizing we need to kind of take the Canadian personality, drive it right into our project, and go and tell the world a story.
Yeah, and define a little bit of what that narrative needed to be at that time. And I want to know also, how did it shift by the time you got the games? Like, what was the narrative?
The key message was always the same, and that was, I remember my first meeting with Jack Poole was on September 11, 2001 in his office, the day of the bombing.
Oh dear, yeah.
And it was the day we aligned on the vision that we were going to try to put this at the disposal of the country and so on. So that was, a early part of the story, and that was what we said and how we said it all along. But a key part of selling Vancouver to the world was there was a kind of a noticeable distance between the United States and the Olympic movement in general. The relationship wasn't terrific, and we had this feeling that the IOC might very much like to be in North America and have all of the American assets and attributes, but not actually be under the kind of, I guess, the thumb of the U.S. Olympic Committee at the time. That was a theory we had, right or wrong, who knows. But we wanted to present ourselves as uniquely Canadian with all of those assets, but in a country like Canada where we are naturally humbled, we're welcoming, very diverse, and we have this belief that the Olympic Games can really do something profound here that maybe, here's the thing, at the end of the Games, Jacques Rogue's first phrase at one of the press conferences on the day after it all closed, he said, the Olympic Games can never go back from this. Mm-hmm. To me, that was a real key point about what the Games had actually achieved on the ground in Vancouver. People were in the streets in Montreal and Newfoundland and Halifax and Calgary and everywhere, and it was clear that it mattered to every citizen that it be successful. They all felt like they owned it.
Keep on that. How would you describe what the Games did 10 years later now? What did they do? For the city, of course, but there are other cities all around us that had facilities. Of course, up in Whistler, lots of facilities, and then across the country, a rapt attention of this for a period of a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
are you able to kind of understand?
Yeah, well, I think, I'm probably not the right guy to probably be the one to answer that question, but what I hear from people and what I think happened is that, we became real believers in this idea that we can do these grand things together. I remember having arguments with very seasoned politicians along the way about this idea that we had, that this needs to be about every Canadian. This needs to touch every life. and being questioned about how outrageous that sounds and how, almost, mystical it sounds. And saying to them that, this is the last place you'd expect to have to make this argument with people who are elected to public office, that Canadians are dying to hold hands and be part of something like this. And so what we were, so this idea at the beginning that we'd be nation builders, at the end, how it played out was that every Canadian took a spot. Like, everyone was on the team. As Jack used to say, there's room on the stage for all of us. And I think what the IOC saw on that was a different pathway forward. I mean, London followed that very much like we did and saw this as a terrific way to bring the outer regions of Great Britain to the Olympic Games and share it with the rest of the country. Now, we made a few decisions along the way that aided that along. I mean, we made a hard decision inside of Vancouver 2010 to become active financial supporters of the Olympic team. Never done before by an organizing committee.
Yes.
We raised that money because we thought, if the Canadian team that comes to Vancouver is not strong, and we don't put up a fight, and we repeat our performance of Montreal and Calgary, don't win a gold medal, the country will look at this and go, please tell me this isn't happening. This is a mistake.
I wanted to ask, do you think we would have a vastly different attitude about 2010 if we'd finished sixth in every event?
Dramatically so. Yeah. I think, on the last day of the Games, the 14th gold medal was a key part of the closing chapter. But, Vancouverites probably would have, given the sum total of all the good things that happened, would have probably walked away and thought, it was a fun time. But the rest of the country would have said, what's for lunch? They would have just been they would have thought, again, we sort of failed to reach that level. And so the point was to go toe to toe. And what was really interesting for me, Kirk, in all the years that I've been involved in sport, I've seen Olympic funding go up and down like this over all those years. And when the Vancouver Games ended, there was this feeling in the sport world that we may see the funding now decline.
Mm-hmm.
We've had this run. And the Prime Minister, to his great credit, following the Olympic Games of Vancouver, made the comment as we were kind of, getting ready to move on, to say that winning was in our national interest. It is clear that this matters to Canadians, and we're going to keep doing it. And so today,
own the podium was?
Yes, and we leapt from winter into summer. And so today we are a top 3 powerhouse in the winter, and in the summer we're top 10. Well, when you think about that, we're like number 40 for population in the world, and we're up there now with the powerhouses in the summer, starting from way back. And in the winter, we're a contender. We could be first, second, or third at the Olympic Games. And every game since Vancouver, we've gotten better. So the program, which is everybody wants to know what it is we're doing in there. What are we cooking for dinner? Yeah. And so I think that was a real revelation about the power of sport, and if you get it right, and how nations will come together around the athletes. But without that piece, I don't know what the country would have to say. I do think that piece and this rallying the country together will always be used as part of the argument as to why we should do this. It's just good for the country's spirit.
But it took us out of our comfort zone, didn't it?
It did, yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
This was more like what we would see in the United States with the USA.
Yeah, it was not easy to kind of be strident and cheering and.
Well, when you say you're going to own the podium, that's a statement.
Exactly. And then you walk into a venue like curling, which is one of the great venues of the Olympics, and people are doing the wave. At curling, for God's sake, in curling, it wasn't cool to say a word. Like it was number one obligation you have when you go in the building is to keep quiet. Yeah. And so this was what was going on, and people were embracing this whole thing, but doing it in a way that people looking in from the outside thought it was kind of cool and joining in. And what Canadians did that added very much to the feeling on the ground was they embraced everybody. It wasn't like they kind of dished anyone else. They embraced all of the performances. They obviously went there to help Canada be successful, but they didn't kind of dismiss all of the other performances that were going on. So in a way, they gave the rest of the world a big hug, but they were absolutely the difference maker in getting Canada into that first.
And because position. They were in our backyard, it felt to me in witnessing the games that an awful lot of sports were suddenly validated in the eyes of Canadians, and their athletes probably felt, first of all, that they were recognized, maybe for the first time. And the feeder systems.
Yeah.
You know, the next, the next kids on the hills with snowboards were going to feel, actually this is a good thing. I can do this,
right.
and I can rise and gain international respect for what I'm doing. I mean, it had a whole other charm to it that way.
It did, and listen, when you think of the next Winter Games, which is in Beijing, almost the entire team, give or take a few, will be dreamers from 2010.
Exactly. Yeah.
Young people who woke up in the morning and saw Joanie Richette win that bronze medal, or the gold medal on Sunday, or the women's gold medal in hockey, and say, I want to be one of those, and started down that road, and they are now living that dream, which is, of course, the whole point of it all. And so I do think that all worked quite well.
Is that the biggest piece of the legacy, do you think?
Well, for sport it is, huge. I think there are other legacies for Vancouver beyond that. I mean, I think for sport, I think Vancouver was a stepping off point, because sport has been going cap in hand to the government for decades, asking for support, and there's always been this suspicion that we'd never our act together, and that we would come and ask and have a program and launch it, and we'd do okay, but we weren't kind of really getting. People felt we were not really hitting it at the level that they expected of us. We weren't winning gold medals at home and so on. And so I think what happened with this was it just kind of made believers out of everybody, and of course it changed fundamentally our view of the power of all of this, and what happens when you give athletes a fighting chance, give them the tools and so on.
It also, I think, opened up the wallets of corporate Canada in a massive way, right?
Listen, when at VANOC, I remember actually it was high drama when the Canadian Olympic Committee came out to see us 2004, and they said, the games are going to be ho-hum to the rest of the country if we don't produce a great team. And the problem is we can't do it. And the reason we can't do it is because all the intention's on you. All the money is going to you. You guys are going to partners, and they're giving you all their money. Everyone's betting the farm on Vancouver 2010. And so, there's a possibility here we could stage these games and disappoint the country. I sat and listened to that, and first of all, as a sports person, it was an easy argument to make, and I agreed with it. But getting VANOC, who was up to their neck in challenges of its own, to take on the added responsibility of now preparing the Olympic team, that was a tall ask. And I remember going to the board and sitting in front of our board and saying, listen, this is the thing we're talking about. And we have done this study. And we have discovered in this study that's going to cost $110 million to prepare the Olympic team over 5 years. But if we do, we will have the team to beat in Vancouver. But the problem is raising this money is either going to be up to us or it's not going to happen. And think of it this way. The view out there is that if we don't produce this piece, the rest of the country will see the Olympic Games as just something that was kind of cool for a few weeks. It will not leave this legacy. Honestly, I thought I was going to get fired. There was an argument in the room. Directors were very annoyed and thinking, how can we get put in this position? We have enough to do.
You were sandbagging him for $110 million.
Yeah.
Well, I think most boards would
So
be
we
a little
cut a
upset with
deal
that.
with the board that we would go to the federal government and tell this story, and we'd split the difference with them, 50-50, 55 each. So we took a plan to Ottawa, a room full of sport executives, VANOC, Stephen Owen from Vancouver, and put to him that this is the secret sauce for Vancouver 2010. And that's the fastest turnaround on a report I've ever seen in 40 years in Canada. And Stephen Owen came back and he said, let this be the test case for this country about whether we have it in us to be this good. And if we win in Vancouver, then we know we can do it, and maybe we can apply this to the summer. And I took the report and went home with $55 million, and we started. And for the first few years, we were kind of winging it a bit, and then we got organized. And then, of course, Torino, we hit it out of the park, and then in Vancouver, we, it's just fantastic.
Everybody looks like a genius now, right?
Oh, very much so.
You were kind of hatching something here.
We were.
Could have been.
We were hatching
been
it and
full of it.
trying to
Yeah.
figure out, what are the difference makers. We had these secret programs, and we had these secret sciences, and we were attracting people out there who had these reputations for having this, little tiny idea
Right.
that we could use, and
A slider suit
and
that
everyone
gave
heard
everybody
about, and
100th of
everyone
us.
heard about it, and people were wondering what we were up to, and so we got a lot of attention, and of course the phrase "on the podium" kind of stuck in a lot of people's throats, but it was a message, and I think also, I think the government saw in it a message: we're not messing around. We've actually made a decision, a business decision, to go after this the right way, and let's see if we're up to it, and it worked out. And so today, on the podium is a highly sophisticated agency today. They're doing all kinds of things today they weren't doing in 2010, and the results are getting better and better and better and better. And so, I think Canada has done a good thing with this.
A couple of other legacy issues I think we want to talk about. One is transportation. How important was it that there was a commitment to widen that dangerous highway heading to Whistler?
Hugely important. It's interesting, actually, when we were talking about the road, because what was going on in one area was that people were saying that, the cost to do all of this is going up. Well, we'd been talking about the road, and we'd been talking about the airport and the train and everything for a long time, but it never really had any momentum going. And I remember Jack sitting, talking to government ministers about the road. He said, look, we'll do the bid without the road. If you don't want to do this road, if you don't want to, do what you've been talking about doing for the last 20 years, if you don't want to do that, we'll put in the bid without that road. But our chances of winning are going to be diminished huge. It's going to really raise the bar on the degree of difficulty for us if you do that. And so the government decided to get off this 10, 12, 15-year path and fast-track that decision and go do that road. And it's fascinating. There was a rumor that went around pushed out by one of the other cities, that we actually were just talking gibberish about the road. We actually weren't going to do it. And I remember after we got the games, a couple of weeks after we got the games, the road work started. And we had a visit from the IOC. And I thought it'd be a cool thing to bring them up to Whistler by helicopter. So we got in a helicopter and we flew over the mountains. We didn't go up by the roadway, we went over the mountains. And on the way up there, they looked at us and said, why are we flying this way to Whistler? And I said, well, because this is more beautiful. And we just thought you'd like to see, the beautiful lakes up here and so on. Yeah, do you think we could fly down the road on the way back and see if you're actually doing what you said you were doing? I said, of course, we can do that. So, of course, we have our meeting in Whistler, and they're all gaga-eyed about the plans up there and happy, and they think everything is going well, and there's signs of progress. And we get in the helicopter to come back, and we fly down the road. And there are 4 separate construction crews on the road. And I swear that when we landed in Vancouver, they thought they were crews we put out for the day. That they were super impressed that we were on it.
Well, other countries might have staged that.
Yeah, they could.
Well, but, Canada, you wouldn't have gotten away with it.
Yeah, and so the road was a big deal, and and I think today it kind of it was quite interesting, because I don't know if you remember, but when they came to evaluate whether Vancouver's bid was serious and solid, the commission came to Whistler, and good guys, all of them. And the guy who led the commission had my job in Norway for Lillehammer. We became friends. Good guy and charismatic, liked to be at the microphone, liked talking about the games, and loved telling Lillehammer stories. And we get into Whistler, and the media come around him, and like 50 people, and they ask him, so tell us about the road. And he turned to the media, and the first words that came out of him were, "It's too far to Whistler." And as he said it,
I remember that. I actually remember that.
Yeah, and as he said it, he died. Like he knew right away. It was like throwing a rock right at the organization. And so I kind of tried not to show the body language of disappointment, but so I grabbed him aside and said, you have to, Gerard, you have to fix this. You have to explain this in a way that people will understand. I mean, there have been longer roads than this, and. And I said, so the media are going to write a story tomorrow that's going to go all over the world, that the road is too long. I mean, this is quite a thing for us to have to answer for.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think I remember that story.
So later that day, they interviewed him again. He said, well, you can't interfere. Nature is what it is, we're very optimistic that they'll build a good road and they'll have plans and they'll get this done. But it was hanging there. So Dick Ebersol, the head of sports for NBC, he heard all this. And he was a huge fan of having the games in Vancouver because to him it was like having them in New York,
Sure.
And so he got interviewed and he was asked about the road. And he said, I'll tell you what's wrong with that road. It's not long enough. And he said the trip on that road is one of the great drives of the world. And of course, we started to shift and the road it's a project. How much is it going to cost? Will it be on time? Are good people doing it? And it turned out to be quite an asset. But what the interesting thing lost in the transportation, and the train, of course, was amazing. We didn't actually use the train in our Olympic transit plans. We just thought it was going to be important for people getting around the city. But we didn't use it for athletes or officials.
Well, it wasn't particularly stationed near any facilities much of anyway.
It stopped at the Olympic Village, but we didn't even stop there.
Yeah.
It was like security closed kind of thing. Anyway, so there was that, and then there was the improvements to the airport. All this was going on. But there was I don't know if you remember this, but there was a great argument going on in the city about what's their transportation plan. Like, this is stuff they're building, but what's the plan? And they were like yelling at us all the time. And I kept saying to our guys, we're not going to answer that question until we're sure of it, because, you lose your credibility really fast when you keep changing your position. And so we had a board trade lunch. We'd been in this thinking for a while about what was the secret sauce for transportation in the city. And we made a decision on it, and we decided to announce it at the Board of Trade get-together, which was always this big love-in we always had every year. There was about 1,000 people or so there that day, and we came and we tried to give them inside look at what's going on, what the challenges are, how well we're doing, and so on. And I said, and I know you're all here to hear about what the transportation plan is for the games. So here it is. We're going to ask the people of the city of Vancouver to park their cars. That's it. And I remember there's this giggling in the room, and people were going, "Are you kidding me? Like, what are you talking about?" And I said, "You see, this is the thing, that the people of this city have been waiting for 7 years to be asked what they need to do to make this work. And this is what they need to do. And we believe they will. They'll celebrate doing this. And we are going to go door to door to door in this city and ask every business leader to commit to this, to have their people work from home, have them carpool, to have them walk to work." And we had a 25 to 36% traffic off the road for the period of the games.
I got to work faster, by the way.
Yeah,
I just want everybody to know.
Exactly.
I felt a little guilty about doing it, but I did.
Yeah. So the legacies, I think, and then I heard shortly after the games that the train hit its 5-year numbers in 2 months. And
well, that was the other thing. The Canada Line was supposed to be a bit of a ghost train.
Yeah, I know.
Not quite.
No, it's phenomenal, and
we probably need like longer stations.
Yeah,
3 and 4 cars, not 2 cars.
Well, and we learned a lot about how this stuff can really hurt you at other games. I mean, I don't know if you recall, but in Salt Lake, when Salt Lake had the games after 2001, after the bombings, and they almost had those games canceled.
Exactly.
And I remember thinking, they'd done a great job down here, and we were there and learning still. We hadn't got the games yet, and learning, and a really good job. And there was a good spirit on the ground. But on the day the games ended, we all headed to the airport. And there were 11-hour waits to get on a plane. It was a disaster, a gong show. And all that good work that had been done was getting knocked away. People were very annoyed, missing flights and leaving late and security issues, the whole 9 yards. And I remember standing at the airport saying, we cannot have this happen to us.
No kidding.
And we went straight to the airport. And I remember meeting with Larry Berg and saying, Larry, it's not just good enough for the airport to be organized. You need to be a partner. You need to have skin in the game here. Like, you need to be a part owner of this solution. This cannot happen. And they bought in, and the airport was like an Olympic venue.
Well, it felt like a facility.
Yeah,
it felt
and
totally
so
like a facility.
They got in on board. And I remember the day we left, when the games were over, I went out to the airport to see people off, and there was thousands and thousands and thousands of people getting out of Vancouver that day. And the airport was just like a well-oiled machine. People were happy. They were giving out drinks and playing music and food, and they really came to play. And it was interesting because when the games were over, and people were kind of thinking back to their memories, I had a phone call from the King of Holland, who's now the King of Holland. At the time, he was the Crown, like the Prince of Orange, I guess it was his name. Willem is his name, who became friends. He was on our evaluation commission. And he said, I'm phoning to get permission from you for something. And I said, well, what's that? He said, I'm planning to go and speak to some body that's connected into the European Union about the kind of systems that you put in place, the government authorities and their performance at the Olympics, which I consider to be the best I have ever seen, and I'd like your permission to be able to go up and say that. And I said, by all means. He said, I thought the airport was just simply a class above anything we have ever seen, and some of the other things that you did that are remarkable. And so that was good to hear, because it's easy for us to say it, but when other people were actually looking at it and saying, we can learn from them.
And one other area that I think it bears saying, there's an entire neighborhood that now exists that didn't exist before the games, and
just below us here.
And not everything went particularly smoothly. Right, you had your hiccups with that one around finances and things like that. But if you take a look at again how significant that was, first of all, in establishing the bid and in conducting the games, how does Olympic Village fit in to the narrative of 2010?
Well, I think the Olympic Village became a difference maker also in the story of what Vancouver would present. We were prepared to say that we were willing to go onto that piece of property. We had a debate, by the way, about whether we would do it there or at UBC.
Yes.
And so we had this about going onto that piece of property and cleaning it and building this extraordinary, out of this world, community on the most beautiful piece of land in Vancouver, and build a whole new neighborhood for the city there. And the athletes would actually wake up in the morning to views of the city and views of the mountains, and they'd have access to the water and all of that. And we told that story and so on. And I remember at the time thinking, this is a story we have to tell particularly well, because this village thing is quite contentious at the games, and we had experience before us of all kinds of village chaos that had took place at other cities, and we were determined to get this right. And I remember when we were talking about doing it, and driving. I used to live in Richmond at the time, and I would drive into the city once in a while and walk up onto the bridge and look down there and try to imagine, so you could tell the story about how this will play out. And I would say that it and one or two other things we did went way past anything any of us could dream up about how good it would be. And we went through that big challenge, but I think it came full circle. And I lived there for a while, and I think the people down there, I walk through it all the time, and I feel that they're in a privileged area of the city. It's got a great story to it.
It's got a distinct feel to it. Very quickly, it's established itself. Very few neighborhoods do that quickly. Right? Yeah.
So I think it's a great legacy. And of course, lost in the legacy story on housing is what took place in Worcester. So Worcester was becoming, their problems were just brutal, because nobody could afford to live there and work there at the same time. So when we built that community there, that was to basically provide housing for employees. And that has been a runaway success. And we left behind that other facility there so that athletes from around the country could come to Whistler, train on Olympic venues, and stay in accommodation that was affordable, because Whistler just wasn't affordable at the time. So those were, I think, good legacies.
The facilities up there, of course, are great. I kind of wish, though, that somewhere we had a ski jump in the area.
Well, there was for 5 minutes we talked about actually ski jumping in the city.
Wow.
In the city.
That would have been good.
Actually, no one's ever asked me about that before.
Yeah.
We actually talked about it for a bit to think about.
Where? Like where?
Well, it's somewhere, just actually find a way to, because when you actually look at it, it's a fairly, isolated type of thing. It's not like you can't create the backdrop. I mean, it typically sits on the side of a hill, but actually all it needs is something to lean against. And so we did talk about, because there was a time when we were talking about the balance of venues between Vancouver and the mountains and what that would look like. And eventually it just became, one of those outrageous ideas we had to set aside. But
I think Granville would have been a great.
And there was a discussion about even having it on Grouse Mountain. And then one of the arguments was made is that, if it got covered in fog, and it would just not be, there's a lot of stuff went into it. And we also realized that we were building a venue there that probably was going to be a disappointment post-games. And so right away we made that clear that we don't have a culture for this. So we built a venue that could be dismantled. It could be shipped off, and maybe someday it will. It's been used a number of times since, but the sport in this country is just fighting for its life, and so it's hard to say that we'll ever see
and of course,
there.
The women were fighting like crazy at that point. The other facility that I had to recognize right away was going to be dismantled was the skating oval. I mean, that in a way it was being built on land that wasn't going to sustain anyway that international standard that was necessary. But you've been able to, to morph these facilities into other types of things.
Yeah.
The Hillcrest Community Center now exists as a result of all of this, and there are other types of things. A couple of things before we're done. Given the context that we now have, could the games ever come back here?
I think so. I think they could. I mean, I think there's a limited time where all of what we've done now could still play a big role. Mm-hmm. That will expire at a certain time, except for the fact that these venues are healthy and they're being well run, and they're not draining people of funds. People are not walking into them and holding their nose and so on. So yes, I think the interesting thing that's going on in the world today, which we did not benefit from when we were bidding, is that the IOC has taken a completely different view of games. And so I think today, to go and get the games, I think the terms are different. It's a negotiation now between a city and the IOC, and they're meeting organizations halfway on stuff. So it's conceivable that, if Vancouver decided to, I tried to get a response from Vancouver when Calgary bid, because it was fresh and our reputation was strong, and there was just no appetite at the city.
You mean for a dual city type of thing?
No, for us to do it. Yeah. We have everything, and a high level of expertise and people on the ground, and very experienced media, government, all of it, all still here, very savvy public,
reunite the band type of thing.
Yeah, and credibility with the IOC, who saw us as a kind of a bit of a beacon to point to. I mean, we get called all the time to go and do work for the IOC. I just came back from Los Angeles and to give a workshop to them on the approach we took to vision, and did the same for Paris and did the same for Beijing. And so we are viewed through a lens that, we got it right, and we were good partners, and we played fair and all that, and the results were, we hit all the markers that we set out to hit. And so I think, it could happen. But I also think, though, if you ever decide to do that again, you need to ask yourself again, why will we do it again? Like, you have to have a good core purpose.
Sometimes you can't go back.
One. Yes.
Sometimes you can't go back. Yeah.
Well, I just think it could be the same, but you have to say to yourself, could you do the same thing again, or would you try to do a games again, but with a different intended bigger outcome, something else that you want to chase down. And, we're in a 10-year window now, and I think there'll be a lot of talk over the next few weeks about what we did and, what's next. I mean, I think it's important for us to leverage the hell out of what we did in Vancouver, and really continue to believe that this was an example of how we can go about things. I was incredibly disappointed that we just set aside the opportunity we had to host World Cup soccer games.
Oh yeah,
I just thought it was way too fast, and I thought it was, and I think sometimes what happens with these decisions is that they're sort of decided on partisan lines, and I think sport needs to be seen as one of those things that crosses all these lines. But when you think about what we did there, we decided not to sign a contract that was put in front of us by FIFA, but we signed that contract for the Women's World Cup. It was the most successful Women's World Cup ever, to unbelievable attendance, great Canadian team. Mm-hmm. And so we had this chance, and Toronto and Edmonton and Montreal are still in play and are going to get some games. So we had this chance to have these games broadcast to the entire world.
Isn't there still a possibility to get them?
I think it's very, very slim. But here's the thing. Bigger message here is, I think whatever happens there is, when that happened, the immediate reaction, I think, of the serious players in this, like the federal government, the provincial government, city, all of the big players who have to think about, if they want this kind of exposure, is why not, go back and say, well, do we have, is there an answer in the community? Should we talk to the soccer team? Should we talk to the Olympic organizers? Is there a way to do this? Can we overcome these challenges? Can we give the city, a great experience and not take a great? But we never had this discussion.
But it was a new premier.
Yeah,
premier
and I think he's a good guy, and I do think that he
certainly likes
he's a
rugby.
sports guy and likes rugby, and the rugby event is doing really well. And I just think we need to kind of look at these events and ask ourselves, what can we do with these events that are going to be good for all of us?
Well, we won't get another chance at World Cup.
No, I don't think so.
Like
no,
20 years or
not
something.
in our lifetime anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Last question. I need to get the answer that you have in 2020 to the answer that I think would have come about a little less than 10 years ago. Did the games make money?
The games made a little bit of money. They did, yeah. Small bit of money. We had very tiny surplus. We protected about, I can't remember the exact number, but we certainly, we protected a number that was north of 10, 15 million to cover off debts and so on. And whatever then got left after that has been applied to things like the Whistler Sliding Centre and legacy funds for the venues that needed support and so on. And in respect to the construction budget, we didn't use all the money. So when and the problem, in the conversation about the Olympic Games and what they cost and what they didn't cost, we made a decision. It was probably the one absolutely immovable object that we had. We are not going in. We're not delivering the games in the black. This is not happening. The second thing was there was always this belief
in the black or in the red.
Sorry, in the red.
Yeah. Sorry,
we delivered in the black. I beg your pardon. But there was also this kind of feeling out there that the Olympic Games were all government money. Well, the operations of the Games were almost all private sector. The government decided to invest in two big things. The torch relay, to extend it, and it wasn't a huge investment. And they contributed in small ways to the opening ceremonies to broaden the kind of story we could tell. Other than that, it was private sector tickets, all of the other things, TV and everything that IOC that paid for the operation. The venues, which the budget was $580 million, did the venues cost $580 million? No, it cost more. But we didn't ask the taxpayers for the money. We went and found other partners and other ways to do it. Like Richmond, for me, is just a prime example of how you can leverage. We had $63 million to build an oval. That was if we built it in 2003. We're building it in 2010. We realized that venue would be viewed by the world the way we originally designed it as inadequate. It would be not a great legacy. So we decided to try to change that dynamic. We went talking to communities about becoming an Olympic city. Richmond had contributed $500,000 to the bid and asked for nothing. Didn't ask for an invoice, didn't ask for anything or a receipt. They just wanted us to succeed. And we thought they might, along with a few other cities, be interested in becoming a player in this. And they're quite entrepreneurial, and they may look at this as an opportunity. So we thought, well, what if we took our $63 million and went shopping and said to cities, listen, think about your long-term interests. And we have $63 million to spend. We need an oval for the games, a venue that you can do this activity in. Post-games, we're okay with wherever it goes. So if you can see a plan that takes care of your long-term needs and you want to invest in that and help us do what we need to do, we'd like to talk to you about partnership. So the city of Richmond, I called them on the way home I was in the traffic jam on Cambie one night, sitting there, not moving. I called the city manager and said, George, I think I have an idea that you might be interested in about, maybe becoming an Olympic city. He said, I'm all ears. And I said, do you think we could sit down tomorrow? And he said, yeah. And I got in the car with my colleague Terry Wright, and we drove out there. And I drew an oval on a board for him in his office. And I said, so we need this. So now clear that out and say, this is this massive, spectacular space which will be yours for all time. You can plan all of the future activities of the region to come here. You can have whatever vision plan you want. And we think that this is the place to do this, and all we would need you to do is to commit a piece of land to it, take it on, deliver it on time, and deliver it to the standard we need to put on the games. And we'll leave the money behind. And in addition to that, we will provide you with support post-games from our legacy fund that we have. And he's sitting there looking at him, and I can see it's just like he's growing in size in his chair. And he goes down the hall, talk to the mayor, and he comes back. He says, I think we want to have a look at this. And so they came up with the idea that they would sell a piece of property on the river to a developer. And they had never really capitalized in Richmond in their waterfront at all.
No, it was kind of
it's kind
dormant.
strange.
It was dormant territory when I visited.
So they had that piece of land there, and they went to market, and they had an auction, I guess, for the land, and a developer paid $140 million for that, for which about 100 was applied to the Oval to build the best building in the world. 40 million went in the bank, and a community has been built around the Oval. It's just a crazy success story. And the last time I visited there, before their current CEO retired, he told me that they had, I think it was either 16 or 20 profitable quarters in a row, where they're growth quarters in a row. I'm sorry. So the Oval is doing everything, and they're getting support. And so for them, they're not just sitting on a building and letting it get tired. They're putting new stuff into it. They're attracting more events. There's national teams located out there. I mean, there's no building in the world that's doing what they're doing today. Maybe there will be someday, but they're the example, and everyone comes to see it. So it turned out to be one of those great, stories that came out of nothing. Creativity, but the taxpayers weren't asked to foot the bill.
You could talk for hours and hours, and I could listen for hours and hours and ask questions for hours and hours, but we have to break it off there. But John Furlong, thanks so much for being a guest. Congratulations. You going to do any celebration on the 10th anniversary day?
I think just generally.
Might have
there's a lot going on, but probably. Yeah.
Get a...
Yeah, I'm sure the phone will be ringing a little bit, and thinking back, my kids are kind of excited, and we had a great time. It was a huge period that I think the memories of 2010 are about to get very much larger.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
good.
All right,
thanks a lot for your time.
You bet.
John Furlong, former CEO of our Winter Games here. I'm Kirk LaPointe. Thanks a lot for watching.